The Galactic Pedagogical Institute of Advanced Sciences floated in the neutral zone between the Andromeda and Triangulum galaxies, a monument to intellectual superiority that made every species who attended feel simultaneously privileged and inadequate. The station itself was a masterwork of collaborative engineering, assuming you found geometric impossibilities and gravity-defying architecture collaborative rather than, showing off. Crystalline spires jutted from a central sphere roughly the size of Earth's moon, each tower dedicated to a different field of study, each one gleaming with the self-satisfied shimmer of pure academic pretension. Here, in this floating cathedral of higher learning, the galaxy's most brilliant minds gathered to prove just how brilliant they were, which mostly involved making everyone else feel stupid. The Institute accepted only 0.003% of applicants, and those lucky enough to receive admission often spent their first semester wondering if rejection might have been the kinder option. The academic environment was cutthroat, the competition fierce, and the coffee absolutely terrible, which seemed like a universal constant even civilizations with faster-than-light travel couldn't solve. The hierarchies here weren't official, of course. No one posted rankings on the cafeteria walls or announced superiority during morning assemblies. That would be crude. Instead, everyone simply understood that certain species were naturally more gifted than others. A truth so self-evident that questioning it marked you as hopelessly naive or, worse, human. The Zothrene occupied the uncontested top tier, their four-lobed brains and crystalline neural pathways producing cognitive processing speeds that made quantum computers look like abacuses operated by particularly slow mollusks. Below them, a comfortable distance below them, clustered species like the Vordani, the Klepthar, and the Manthrex, all respectable intellectuals who'd never quite achieved Zothrene levels of genius, but could at least understand the concepts after several hours of meditation and possibly some prescription assistance. And then, several rungs down the ladder, past the insectoid Zurin and the gaseous Peluvians, somewhere between showed promise and why are they here, you found humanity. Humans. Those bizarre bipedal mammals from that unremarkable yellow star, whose neural architecture resembled random spaghetti thrown at a wall, whose emotional regulation was practically non-existent, and whose survival strategy throughout evolution appeared to be stubbornness combined with throwing rocks at problems until the problems went away. That they'd achieve space travel at all was considered either a statistical anomaly or evidence that the universe had a sense of humor, that the Institute had accepted a human student as part of some diplomatic exchange program was viewed as either inspirational charity or administrative error, depending on who you asked. Lecture Hall 7 existed in a state of perpetual twilight, its walls lined with holographic displays that shifted between mathematical proofs and star charts with nauseating frequency. The seats arranged themselves in concentric circles descending toward a central platform, because apparently even furniture needed to emphasize hierarchy. Approximately 40 students occupied the space this particular rotation, representing 12 different species and approximately 500 metric tons of unearned confidence. At the center of this intellectual thunderdome stood Professor Kilvath, a Manthrex whose 6 manipulator arms gestured enthusiastically, while his primary mouth delivered lectures and his secondary mouth provided sarcastic commentary about student performance. His species had evolved on a high-gravity world where thinking fast meant survival, which had blessed them with impressive cognitive speed and cursed them with the personality of someone who's permanently in a hurry. He wore the traditional academic robes of his homeworld, which looked less like clothing and more like someone had gift-wrapped a tree trunk, and his eyes, all 4 of them, never stopped moving, cataloging every student's attention level and judging them accordingly. The course was advanced quantum manipulation theory, which was exactly as fun as it sounded, meaning not at all. The subject matter dealt with the practical application of quantum mechanics to technology, specifically how to convince subatomic particles to do useful work instead of their preferred activity of existing in superposition and making physicists cry. It required understanding mathematics that would make most civilizations weep, physics that violated common sense, and engineering principles that treated the laws of thermodynamics as polite suggestions rather than actual laws. Vector occupied his usual position in the second-tier seating, close enough to the professor to demonstrate engagement, but high enough to look down on everyone below. Literally. His Zothrine physiology stood nearly 8 feet tall when fully extended, his crystalline skin refracting light into subtle rainbow patterns that made him look like a particularly aggressive disco ball. His cranium, enlarged to accommodate his superior brain, swept back in elegant ridges that his people considered beautiful and everyone else considered vaguely threatening. He dressed in the minimalist style favored by his species. Simple garments that announced he was too intellectually advanced to care about fashion, which was itself a fashion statement requiring considerable care. Vector had built his reputation systematically over 3 academic cycles, dismantling the confidence of other students with the precision of a surgeon and the mercy of a black hole. His technique was elegant in its cruelty. He'd wait until a professor posed a complex problem, allow some unfortunate volunteer to attempt an answer, and then, just as they finished explaining their solution, he'd raise one long crystalline finger and begin. Not aggressively. Never aggressively. That would be crude. Instead, he'd speak slowly, carefully, as if explaining reality to a child who'd asked why the sky was blue and received an explanation involving dragons. He'd identify the logical flaw, trace it back through the victim's reasoning, and demonstrate precisely where their inferior neurology had led them astray. The professors rarely intervened. After all, academic rigor demanded honesty. And if some students couldn't handle honesty, perhaps they shouldn't be at the institute. His most recent victim had been a klepthar named Zixoth, who'd spent 2 hours presenting a thesis on crystalline power matrices only to have Vector dismantle it in 12 minutes. Zixoth had transferred to a different program the next rotation. Before that, a Vordani student had attempted to argue with Vector about gravitational constant calculations and ended up leaving the lecture hall in tears, which was impressive considering Vordani had no tear ducts and had to special order the crying from their emotional regulation center. The pattern was established, the hierarchy clear. Vector was untouchable, and everyone knew it. Everyone except, apparently, the human sitting in the back row. She'd arrived at the Institute 6 rotations ago, part of some exchange program that had raised eyebrows across multiple appendages and facial structures. Humans were curious additions to any academic environment, like bringing a golden retriever to a philosophy conference. Enthusiastic, certainly. Well-meaning, probably. Likely to contribute anything meaningful? The probability approached 0 faster than a collapsing wave function. Her name didn't matter to most students, who simply referred to her as the human, with the same tone one might use for the decorative plant or that stain nobody's bothered cleaning. She sat alone, always in the same seat, taking notes on an actual physical tablet like some primitive from the pre-digital era, her presence tolerated but not welcomed, acknowledged but not respected. She was unremarkably human in appearance, which meant she looked bizarre to everyone else. Bilateral symmetry, which was common enough, but only 2 eyes, positioned frontally like a predator, which made every conversation slightly unsettling. Hair, an evolutionary artifact that served no thermal regulation purpose in controlled environments. pulled back in a simple configuration. Her clothing was standard institute uniform, but somehow it looked different on her, less elegant and more utilitarian, as if she'd dressed for function rather than form. She rarely spoke during lectures, never volunteered answers, and generally conducted herself with the quiet presence of someone who'd learned that visibility and safety were inversely correlated. Professor Kilvath had just finished explaining the theoretical framework for dimensional bridging, a concept that involved convincing space-time to create temporary shortcuts between points, essentially making the universe work harder so travelers could work less. His manipulator arms traced complex equations in holographic space, while his primary mouth delivered the lecture, and his secondary mouth criticized everyone's posture. The topic was challenging enough that most students looked like they were contemplating career changes, their expressions ranging from confused to existentially disturbed. "Now then," Kilvath announced, his secondary mouth adding, "assuming anyone was actually paying attention," which earned nervous laughter from approximately nobody. The practical implementation requires solving for the dimensional coefficient while maintaining quantum coherence across the bridge threshold. Who can explain the primary challenge in maintaining coherence during the transition phase? Several hands, tentacles, and one pseudopod rose hesitantly. Vector didn't bother raising anything. He never did. He simply waited, knowing that eventually someone would say something wrong, and then it would be his time. A Jarin student named Click Whir, whose name actually translated to something about morning dew but sounded like a broken appliance to everyone else, attempted an answer. His insectoid form vibrated nervously as he explained his understanding of coherence maintenance, his compound eyes reflecting the holographic displays in kaleidoscopic patterns. His answer was actually decent, demonstrating solid grasp of the fundamentals and reasonable extrapolation of the advanced concepts. For a Jarin, it was exceptional. For this class, it was almost adequate. Almost. Vector waited exactly 3 seconds after Click Whir finished, a calculated pause that drew everyone's attention without seeming eager. Then he spoke, his voice carrying the crystalline resonance his people were known for, beautiful and cutting simultaneously. "An admirable attempt," he began, which everyone recognized as the academic equivalent of "bless your heart." However, your explanation operates under a fundamental misunderstanding of quantum coherence that's quite common among species whose neural architecture processes information sequentially rather than simultaneously. You're treating coherence as a binary state, present or absent, when in fact it exists on a continuous spectrum that requires multidimensional modeling to properly represent. The mathematics alone would require computational capacity that... He paused delicately. Well, let's simply say it requires certain cognitive capabilities. Click Whir's antennae drooped. Around the lecture hall, students shifted uncomfortably or, depending on their disposition, settled in to enjoy the show. Professor Kilvath said nothing, his 4 eyes tracking between Vector and Click Whir with the detached interest of someone watching a nature documentary about predators. Furthermore, Vector continued, warming to his subject the way a solar flare warms to incinerating planets. Your proposed solution for maintaining coherence during transition relies on external stabilization fields, which demonstrates a rather primitive approach to the problem. Advanced civilizations solved this particular challenge 4,000 rotations ago by utilizing intrinsic quantum properties rather than crude external manipulation. But of course, not everyone has access to such historical knowledge. The statement hung in the air like a death sentence. Click Whir managed something between a nod and a slump, which was impressive body language from someone whose body was mostly carapace. That's when it happened. Actually, a voice said from the back row, that's incorrect. The silence that followed was the kind usually reserved for spatial anomalies or moments right before explosions. Every student turned, their various biological equivalents of heads swiveling toward the source. Professor Kilvath's secondary mouth stopped mid-criticism, both mouths now hanging open in synchronized shock. Vector's crystalline skin flickered, his biological equivalent of a double take. The human was standing. Not dramatically, not making a show of it. She'd simply risen from her seat, her physical tablet in one hand, her expression neutral in that unsettling way humans had, where you couldn't tell if they were about to laugh or attack or both simultaneously. "I'm sorry," Vector said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sorry at all. "Did you just suggest that I'm incorrect?" "I didn't suggest it," she replied calmly. "I stated it. Your understanding of historical quantum coherence solutions is based on Zathrine methodology, which, while impressive, isn't actually the most efficient approach. It's just the most complicated, which aren't the same thing, though I understand the confusion." Someone in the third row made a sound like a dying hyperdrive. This wasn't happening. Humans didn't challenge Zathrine students. Humans didn't challenge anyone. Humans sat quietly, took their notes, and tried not to embarrass themselves too publicly. This was like watching a houseplant declare war on the sun. Vector's skin patterns shifted, moving from their usual subtle rainbow to something sharper, more aggressive. "I see. And you, with your linear human neurology and sequential processing limitations, believe you've identified a flaw in Zathrine quantum theory? How fascinating. Please enlighten us. I'm certain the entire class would benefit from your unique perspective." The sarcasm could have corroded hull plating. The human didn't flinch. "The problem with Zathrine quantum methodology is that it's optimized for Zathrine neural architecture. Your species processes information through crystalline lattice structures, which means you naturally gravitate toward solutions that involve complex harmonic resonance patterns. It works for you. It's elegant for you. But calling it the universal solution is like claiming everyone should breathe chlorine because it works great for the Peluvians." "That's a false equivalency," Vector shot back. "We're discussing quantum mechanics, not biological necessities." "Are we?" "Because your entire approach to coherence maintenance assumes the operator has four-lobed simultaneous processing capability. The mathematics you're so proud of literally cannot be performed by a sequential processing mind without computational assistance. You've created a solution that requires your biology to implement, then claimed superiority when other species can't naturally do what you do naturally. That's not advanced science. That's just bias with equations." Professor Kilvath's manipulator arms had frozen mid-gesture. Around the lecture hall, students were experiencing the academic equivalent of watching a train crash into a space station. This was unprecedented. This was unthinkable. This was the best thing that had happened all semester. Vector's skin was now pulsing with sharp, aggressive light patterns. "Very well. Since you've identified this supposed flaw, perhaps you'd care to propose an alternative? One that your admittedly limited human neurology can actually comprehend." "Sure." The human tapped her tablet, and suddenly holographic equations bloomed above her head. Mathematics that looked simultaneously familiar and completely wrong. "Humans can't do parallel processing like you do. Our brains are slow compared to yours. Sequential, limited. So we had to figure out quantum coherence maintenance using approaches that don't require super Zathrine computational ability." She walked down toward the central platform, her movements drawing every eye in the lecture hall. When she reached the display area, she gestured, and her equations expanded, filling the space with symbols and operators that made several students flinch. This is the human approach to dimensional bridging coherence. Instead of maintaining perfect quantum states through continuous harmonic adjustment, which requires constant computational monitoring and correction, we use a technique called cascading probability anchoring. Essentially, instead of fighting quantum uncertainty, we exploit it. Exploit uncertainty? Vector's tone could have frozen hydrogen. That's thermodynamically impossible. Uncertainty is fundamental to quantum mechanics. You can't exploit it. You can only compensate for it. According to Zathrine physics, sure. But you're thinking about uncertainty as a problem to solve. We think about it as a tool to use. Watch. She manipulated the holographic display, running a simulation that showed a dimensional bridge forming. Unlike the complex harmonic patterns of Zathrine methodology, the human approach looked chaotic, probability clouds shifting and collapsing in patterns that seemed random until you looked closer and realized they were anything but. Human neurology is bad at lots of things, she continued, her voice carrying a lecturing tone that was absolutely roasting Vector's usual position as class expert. But we're very good at pattern recognition in chaos. We evolved as pursuit predators on a world where everything was trying to kill us. So our brains got exceptionally good at finding patterns in apparently random systems. When we started working on quantum bridging, we didn't try to eliminate uncertainty. We mapped it. We found the patterns in probability collapse, the rhythms in quantum fluctuation. The simulation continued, showing how instead of forcing quantum states into predetermined configurations, the human method identified natural probability currents and rode them, making constant micro-adjustments based on pattern prediction rather than direct calculation. The energy requirements are 60% lower than Zathrine methodology, she said, pulling up comparative data that made Vector's skin flicker dangerously. The computational overhead is 90% reduced. Any species with basic pattern recognition and decent reaction time can operate it, not just civilizations with crystalline neural architecture. Oh, and the dimensional bridges are actually more stable because you're not constantly fighting against quantum uncertainty, you're moving with it. Vector started, then stopped. His four-lobed brain was clearly processing at maximum capacity, running through her mathematics, checking her logic, searching desperately for the flaw that had to be there. Because humans didn't revolutionize quantum physics. That wasn't how the galaxy worked. Impossible? She offered. The proof is right there. Run the simulation yourself. The math works. It works really well, actually. Professor Kilvath finally moved, his manipulator arms reaching out to examine the holographic equations. His primary mouth was working silently. His secondary mouth completely silent for perhaps the first time in recorded history. He ran his own verification protocols, checking the mathematics with the decades of experience that had earned him his position. His four eyes widened progressively, which was disturbing to watch. This is, he started, his primary mouth finally engaging. This is actually functional. The probability anchoring technique is, by all the stars, why didn't we think of this? Because you didn't need to, the human said, not unkindly. The Zathrine method works perfectly for you. Why would you look for an alternative? You're smart enough to make the hard way work, so you never needed to find the easy way. Humans aren't that smart, so we had to get creative. We don't have crystalline neural lattices, so we can't brute force quantum calculations. We had to find a method that played to our strengths instead of highlighting our weaknesses. She turned to face Vector directly, and her expression was still neutral. but there was something in her predator-positioned eyes that made the Zathreen student step back slightly. You asked earlier about my linear human neurology and sequential processing limitations. You meant it as an insult. But here's the thing about limitations. They force innovation. You know what else humans are really good at, besides pattern recognition? Improvisation. Lateral thinking. Looking at a problem from weird angles because we don't have the computational power to solve it the proper way. Your species has been doing quantum physics the same way for thousands of rotations because it works, and you're smart enough to make it work. We've been doing it for maybe 200 rotations, and we've had to reinvent the approach 17 times because we keep finding things we can't do the conventional way. Around the lecture hall, the audience had gone completely silent. This wasn't just academic disagreement anymore. This was a fundamental challenge to the hierarchies everyone had accepted as natural law. The question you asked Click earlier, the human continued, about maintaining coherence during the transition phase. His answer was actually closer to correct than yours. Sequential processing species naturally understand state transitions better than simultaneous processing species because we experience time linearly. We can't hold multiple states in our heads at once. So we're really good at understanding the moment when one state becomes another. Click's mistake wasn't his fundamental understanding. It was assuming he should try to apply Zathreen methodology when his own neural architecture was better suited for a different approach entirely. She glanced at the Zharin student, who'd been watching with his compound eyes practically vibrating out of his head. The binary state model you proposed? That's not primitive. That's actually more accurate for practical implementation. Zathreen treat it as a continuous spectrum because they can perceive it that way. But for engineering purposes, threshold states work better anyway. Your answer wasn't wrong. It was just different from what you've been taught to think is sophisticated. Click's antennae slowly lifted. As for external stabilization fields being crude, the human turned back to Vector. That's just technological prejudice. External fields are easier to adjust, easier to replace, and they don't require the operator to be a mathematical genius. They're not primitive, they're practical. Sometimes the simple solution is simple because it's better, not because the people using it are too stupid to understand the complicated version. Vector had progressed through several stages of emotional processing, moving from shocked to angry to confused, and currently landing somewhere in the territory of existential crisis. His crystalline skin was pulsing erratically, patterns of light flickering without coherence, which was probably ironic given the subject matter. This is... He started, stopped, recalibrated. Your methodology might be functional, but it's hardly elegant. Quantum physics should be beautiful, not just practical. Should it? Why? Who decided physics needs to be beautiful? That's aesthetic preference, not scientific principle. She smiled. And it wasn't a nice smile. It was the smile of a pursuit predator who'd just cornered something. Besides, I think probability cascades are gorgeous. All those patterns in chaos. The way quantum uncertainty moves like a river if you know how to look at it. It's beautiful to me. Maybe it's not beautiful to you because your brain processes it differently. Doesn't make either of us right or wrong, just different. She collected her tablet, preparing to return to her seat, then paused. Oh, and Vector. That thing you do where you wait for someone to answer and then explain why their inferior neurology led them astray. That's not academic rigor. That's just being mean. You're smart. Everyone knows you're smart. You don't have to prove it by making everyone else feel stupid. Intelligence isn't a competition where only one person gets to be the winner. Everything here is a competition, Vector replied, but his voice had lost its cutting edge and now sounded more defensive than confident. The Institute accepts only the best. Academic excellence demands we acknowledge superior and inferior approaches. No, it doesn't. Academic excellence demands we find what works. Sometimes what works is complicated and sophisticated. Sometimes it's simple and practical. Sometimes it's weird and counterintuitive. The goal is understanding the universe, not establishing who's got the biggest brain. Well, metaphorically biggest. I think the Peluvians actually have the largest neural structures by volume, though they're gaseous, so measuring is tricky. A ripple of laughter moved through the lecture hall, tentative at first, then growing. The Peluvian student in question made a sound like wind chimes having an identity crisis, which was their species' version of laughing. Professor Kilvath finally stepped forward, his manipulator arms moving in patterns that suggested deep thought or possibly distress. This is unprecedented. I need to review your mathematics fully. But the preliminary analysis suggests your methodology is sound. More than sound, it's potentially revolutionary. How long has Earth been using this approach? About 30 rotations for practical implementation, longer for the theoretical framework. We've been running dimensional bridges on cascading probability anchors for a while now. They work great. Lower energy costs, higher stability, easier training for operators. We shared the methodology with the Institute when I arrived, but I think it got filed under interesting primitive approaches and nobody looked at it. Kilvath's secondary mouth made a sound like grinding gears. I'll be reviewing our intake protocols. This should have been flagged for immediate analysis. It's fine, the human said, genuinely without apparent resentment. I get it. When you receive thousands of papers from species across the galaxy, you probably prioritize based on source credibility. Humans aren't high on that list. Why would we be? We've been doing space travel for like 200 rotations. Everyone else has been at it for thousands. Makes sense you'd focus on civilizations with proven track records. She started walking back up toward her seat, then stopped again, turning to face the class. But here's something worth thinking about. Every species in this room has different neurology, different ways of processing information, different strengths and weaknesses. The Zarin have compound vision that lets them see temporal patterns we can't perceive. The Vordani can hold more information in active memory than seems thermodynamically possible. The Peluvians experience time non-linearly. Everyone here has something unique their biology gives them. She gestured around the lecture hall, encompassing everyone. We spend so much energy establishing hierarchies and ranking who's naturally superior that we forget the entire point of science's collaboration. Combining different perspectives to understand things none of us could figure out alone. Yeah, Zathreen have incredible computational neurology. That's amazing. It also makes you approach every problem like it's a computation challenge. Meanwhile, humans are over here going, but what if we don't compute it? What if we just ride the probability wave and see where it goes? Both approaches are valid. Both reveal different aspects of reality. Vector was still standing in place, looking like someone had replaced his entire understanding of reality with a completely different reality and forgotten to leave instructions. When he spoke, his voice had lost all its crystalline superiority and just sounded tired. So what am I supposed to do? Just accept that everything I've learned about intellectual hierarchy is wrong? Not wrong, the human corrected. Incomplete. You're brilliant at Zathreen-style physics. That's not nothing. That's genuinely impressive. But being brilliant at one approach doesn't mean other approaches are inferior. It just means they're different. Maybe instead of using your abilities to prove everyone else is stupid, you could use them to help translate concepts between different cognitive styles. You can hold multiple complex models in your head simultaneously. That's incredible. Imagine what you could accomplish if you used that to bridge understanding between species instead of establishing dominance. She finally returned to her seat, leaving Vector standing in the center of the lecture hall looking like someone who just had their entire worldview dismantled by what was supposed to be an easy target. Professor Kilvath cleared both throats. Well, this has been educational. I believe we need to take a brief recess while I process the implications of this new methodology. Class dismissed. Except you. He pointed a manipulator arm at the human. You stay. We need to discuss why you've been sitting silently in the back of my class for 6 rotations while possessing information that could revolutionize dimensional physics. The students filed out in stunned silence, their usual chatter replaced by furious, whispered conversations and the occasional shocked exclamation. Click-whir paused by the human seat, his antennae vibrating in what his species used as a gesture of profound respect. She nodded back, a simple human gesture that somehow conveyed solidarity across vastly different biologies. Vector was the last to leave, moving slowly, his crystalline skin flickering in patterns that suggested deep computational processing. At the doorway, he stopped, turned back. "What's your name?" "Does it matter?" she replied. "You've been calling me the human for 6 rotations." "It matters now," she told him. He repeated it carefully, his vocal structure struggling with the human phonemes, but managing something close enough. Then he left, and if his posture was a little less arrogant than usual, well, nobody was going to comment on it out loud. Later, much later, after Professor Kilvath had finished simultaneously praising and berating her for staying quiet so long, after she'd explained that she'd been observing the social dynamics and learning before contributing, after she'd promised to collaborate with the physics department on publishing her methodology properly, she sat alone in the observation deck watching stars drift past. The Institute floated in its neutral zone, unchanged, still a monument to intellectual superiority. But something had shifted in the unwritten hierarchies, a small crack in the assumption that some species were simply better than others. It would take time to widen that crack into something meaningful. Assumptions built over thousands of rotations didn't crumble in a single lecture. But they could start crumbling. And sometimes, a start was enough. The human smiled to herself, thinking about Vector's expression when his entire worldview had collapsed. About Click-whir's antennae lifting, about the way Professor Kilvath's secondary mouth had gone completely silent. She'd come to the Institute expecting to spend a rotation being patronized and dismissed, collecting her diplomatic service credits and leaving without making waves. Turned out, staying quiet had never been humanity's strong suit anyway. Behind her, the door opened. She turned, expecting perhaps a professor or a fellow student. Instead, she found 3 Jurin, 2 Vordani, a Peluvian whose gaseous form was contained in a mobility sphere, and surprisingly, Vector. "We have questions," the Zathrine student said, his tone completely different from his usual lecturing superiority. "About your methodology, about human approaches to quantum mechanics, about different ways of thinking about problems." The human gestured to the seating area, around her. "Sure. Fair warning, though, explaining human logic to non-humans can be weird. We tend to use a lot of analogies involving predator behavior and throwing things." "Predator behavior?" one of the Vordani asked, their tentacles curling with interest. Yeah, humans are persistence predators. We evolved by chasing prey until it collapsed from exhaustion. Turns out that mindset translates surprisingly well to scientific problems. Just keep going at it from different angles until something breaks. Usually the problem. Sometimes your own sanity. But eventually something breaks, and that's progress. Vector settled into a seat, his tall frame folding with uncharacteristic lack of grace. That's actually a fascinating cognitive framework. Zathreen evolved as filter feeders. Our approach to problems is to remain stationary and process everything that comes to us until we've extracted all useful information. It never occurred to me that active pursuit might generate different problem-solving strategies. See, that's the thing, the human said, warming to the subject. Every species' evolution shapes how they think. You can't separate biology from cognition. Understanding that isn't about establishing who's superior. It's about recognizing that we all bring different tools to the table. Sometimes you need a hammer. Sometimes you need a lever. Sometimes you need whatever weird thing humans bring to situations, which is probably stubbornness and inappropriate jokes. The Peluvian made a sound like wind through crystalline structures, their species' version of laughing. Tell us more about human problem solving. This is going to be entertaining at minimum, and possibly educational if we're lucky. So she did. And somewhere in the Institute's administrative levels, filing systems that had automatically categorized human research as primitive but enthusiastic were quietly being updated. It was a start. Sometimes, in a galaxy obsessed with intellectual hierarchies and cognitive superiority, that's all you needed. One person refusing to accept that different meant inferior. One voice saying, actually, you're wrong, and backing it up with mathematics instead of just defiance. One human, sitting in the back row, waiting for exactly the right moment to remind everyone that the universe was bigger and stranger and more complicated than any single species' perspective could encompass. And if that reminder came with a side of publicly dismantling an arrogant Zathreen student's entire worldview, well, that was just good timing. The stars continued their drift past the observation windows, uncaring about academic hierarchies or intellectual competitions or who had the most sophisticated neurology. The universe kept being itself, weird and wonderful and utterly indifferent to anyone's assumptions about superiority, which was exactly as it should be. And the human, surrounded by students from half a dozen species, all arguing enthusiastically about probability cascades and cognitive frameworks, and whether humans' persistence predator evolution really explained their scientific methodology, or if she was just making stuff up, smiled and thought that maybe, just maybe, this rotation at the Institute might turn out to be worth it after all.